On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the sun cast a golden hue over the streets of San Jose. Life moved slowly, here at least in this part of town, where time seemed to linger, where people knew each other by name, and where kindness, though rare, still existed in surprising ways. Among the long line of weary faces, waiting patiently at the edge of a rundown church parking lot, a luxury black sedan pulled up and parked discreetly in the corner. Its polished shine reflected the sharp contrast between wealth and hardship, a mirror held up to life's cruel inequalities. The door opened, and stepping out was a woman who immediately drew attention, not because she intended to, but because she simply didn't belong here. Margaret Whitmore. At 67, she was still the image of elegance. Silver gray hair tied back neatly, a tailored navy coat from a Paris designer, and a brooch that once belonged to her mother, glinting on her lapel. To most people in the Bay Area, she was known as the steel-hearted CEO of Whitmore Holdings, one of the largest real estate empires on the West Coast. But here today, she was just a woman with a heavy heart and a basket of meals. She came alone. No assistant, no press, no grand gestures. Just her, handing out warm meals in silence. This was not charity. For publicity it was penance, a ritual she had kept for the last 5 years, returning month after month to this very corner of the city, seeking something she herself couldn't fully define. Maybe peace, maybe forgiveness, maybe hope. Margaret's eyes scanned the faces of the people who lined up, young mothers holding babies, old men clutching walking sticks, teenage boys with hollow eyes, and small children too quiet for their age. She smiled politely as she placed each boxed meal into trembling hands, whispering soft words of comfort that barely rose above the hum of street noise. But her eyes, they told a different story. Eyes that had known loss. Eyes that carried the weight of a lifetime of choices. Her story, though rarely spoken aloud, was etched into every movement she made. 5 years ago, her only son, David, had died in a car crash on a rainy night, so sudden, so cruel, and so final that it left her breathless for weeks. He was her legacy, her pride, her only child. And with him gone, the sprawling empire she had built over decades seemed meaningless. For what good is a kingdom when the air is buried beneath it? But Margaret's grief ran deeper than the loss of a son. It was laced with regret, bitter and unrelenting. Because she hadn't just lost David to death. She had pushed him away while he was still alive. Her disapproval of his love for a young woman named Anna, whom she deemed unworthy, had driven a wedge between them. She had said things no mother should say. She had used her power, her influence, and even her money to separate them. She thought she was protecting him. But in the end, all she had done was break him. Since then, Margaret had lived in a mansion filled with silence, surrounded by art, antiques, and memories that did not speak back. No laughter, no joy, just echoes. And these visits, these monthly trips to the underbelly of the city, were her way of punishing herself, of staying close to suffering, of remembering that life is fragile, and love, when lost, leaves a void nothing else can fill. And yet, as she handed out another box of food that afternoon, something unusual happened. A child's voice pierced through the fog of her thoughts. Soft, polite, and innocent. "Thank you, ma'am." She looked down, and saw 2 small children, Windsor, boy and a girl, no more than 4 or 5. They were thin, their clothes faded, but their eyes were bright, almost unnaturally so, like stars pressed into tired skin. Margaret felt something stir, a flicker, a pull, a strange tightness in her chest. She didn't understand why these children unsettled her so deeply. But her hands, those same hands that once signed billion-dollar contracts, now trembled slightly as she reached for the next box. And just then, the little boy tugged on her sleeve and said, "Could I have one more, please? For my mom. She's sick and couldn't come." That moment, simple, unassuming, would mark the beginning of everything, of the unraveling, of the truth, of the chance, however slim, that the past might offer one final redemption. As Margaret watched the twins walk away hand in hand down the cracked sidewalk, something inside her refused to remain still. She took a step forward, then another, and without fully realizing it, Margaret Whitmore began to follow them, not as a billionaire, not as a woman haunted by loss, but as a mother, led by instinct, by memory, and by a hope too fragile to name. What she would discover in the shadows of that broken neighborhood would change everything she thought she knew about love, forgiveness, and the price of silence. Margaret had always believed she knew what was best for her son. For David, he had been her miracle, born when she was nearly 40, after a long, painful struggle with fertility. The joy of his birth was something she could still recall with crystal clarity, the first cry, the way his tiny fingers had wrapped around hers. From that moment on, she had made a silent vow to protect him from the world, to build a future so secure, so flawless, that no pain could ever touch him. But life doesn't make room for such promises. Not even from a mother. As David grew older, he inherited more than just Margaret's striking eyes, and his father's calm demeanor. He had a kindness in him that the world didn't often reward. He loved old books, jazz records, and long walks through Golden Gate Park. He saw beauty in things Margaret considered impractical. While she shaped boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar real estate deals, David found fulfillment volunteering at youth shelters and teaching art classes to underprivileged kids. It frustrated her. She couldn't understand why someone born into privilege would be drawn to struggle. But nothing upset her more than Anna. Anna was everything Margaret feared for her son, a soft-spoken working-class woman, with no pedigree, no legacy, no future. As she often put it, she worked as a librarian and had been raised in foster care. Her presence in David's life felt to Margaret like a threatened erasure of all she had built for him, all she had sacrificed. She remembered the first time she met Anna at one of David's art showcases. Margaret smiled politely, but assessed every detail: her plain dress, her nervous posture, the second-hand shoes. And despite Anna's grace, her humility, her genuine affection for David, all Margaret saw was a girl who didn't belong. That night, after the gallery closed and the guests were gone, she confronted David in their penthouse kitchen, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury. "She's not right for you, David. She has nothing. You'll end up carrying her your whole life." David, who had always been gentle with her, stood firm. "She makes me happy, Mom. That should be enough." But it wasn't enough for Margaret. Not then. Not for a woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry, who had survived betrayals and collapses, who had built a life of steel around herself so her child would never suffer. She began to interfere in subtle ways at first. A job offer for David in New York. Business trips she insisted he take at critical moments in his relationship. And then the final blow, meeting with Anna behind his back and offering her a large sum of money to disappear. "Take this," she had said coldly, sliding the envelope across the cafe table. "And don't ever come near my son again." Anna's hands had trembled. She didn't touch the envelope. "I love him," she had whispered. "You don't have to believe me, but I do." Margaret's voice had been icy. "Love is not enough." And Anna, with tears in her eyes, had walked away not with the money, but with her dignity. Margaret convinced herself it was for the best. She believed that, in time, David would thank her. But he never did. For weeks, he searched for Anna, confused, heartbroken, unraveling. He called her, wrote letters, visited places they used to go together. Margaret pretended to console him while silently celebrating the return of her control. But control is not love. And David, who had once been so full of light, began to dim. Then came the night of the crash. A rainy Tuesday in November. David had called her earlier that day, his voice distant. He asked if she'd be home that evening. She said no, she had a dinner meeting with investors. He said it was okay. That he just wanted to talk. Just talk. It was the last time she ever heard his voice. They told her he had lost control of the car on a slick stretch of highway near No alcohol, no other vehicle involved. Just David. Alone. Speeding, perhaps. Distracted. Or maybe just done. The car had wrapped around a tree. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Margaret's world shattered in silence. No scream. Collapse, just an emptiness that moved into her, like a tenant who wouldn't leave. She buried him in a marble mausoleum she had prepared years before, never imagining she would use it so soon. The funeral was filled with people, business partners, friends, reporters, but Margaret stood alone, cold, unreadable. Not because she didn't feel, but because she didn't know how to grieve something she herself had destroyed. Since then, her days had been rituals, board meetings, charity events, empty gestures dressed up in perfection. At night, she wandered her mansion like a ghost, pausing at the door to David's room but never going in. She couldn't bear the stillness, couldn't face the reality, that the only voice she wanted to hear was Ganand, that it may have been her silence, her pride, her need for control that had driven him away. She often asked herself, late at night when no one was watching, what if I hadn't interfered? What if I had simply let him be happy? But the past never answers those kinds of questions, don't. standing alone on a cracked sidewalk watching the twins disappear into the distance. Margaret felt that old ache, the one that had no name but lived behind her ribs. She had lost her son once. She wasn't sure she could bear losing anything again. And so, without quite knowing why, she took another step forward. Something was calling to her, something beyond memory, something in those children's eyes. What she didn't yet know was that the road ahead would take her deeper into her past than she had ever dared go, and reveal a truth more painful and more miraculous than she had ever imagined. Margaret stood still for a moment, the sound of the city fading beneath the soft echo of her memories. The twins were walking away slowly, their small feet tapping against the uneven pavement. Something about them wouldn't let her go. It wasn't just the boy's voice or the girl's wide, gentle eyes. It was something else, a shadow of familiarity, a feeling she hadn't felt in 5 long years. Her driver called her name softly, asking if she was ready to leave, but she didn't respond. She was already moving, her heels clicking awkwardly against the sidewalk as she followed the children from a short distance. Her hands were still clutching the now empty food basket. Her breathing quickened. Something inside her chest, something old and dormant, was beginning to stir. She wasn't used to following anyone. Margaret Whitmore was the one. Others followed her commands, her vision, her path. But now, in the fading light of a Sunday afternoon, she trailed 2 children through back streets and alleys lined with broken fences, graffiti, and the tired scent of a city's forgotten corners. They didn't notice her. The girl held the boy's hand tightly, whispering something only siblings could understand. They turned down a narrow side street and paused in front of a weather-worn building, gray, slanted, with paint peeling from the door like old bark. The boy reached up, struggled with the lock, then gave up and knocked gently. No answer. He turned and said something to his sister. She nodded. Then, he pulled at the collar of his worn sweatshirt, trying to cool off in the heat. And that's when Margaret saw it, a faint, pinkish mark on the side of his neck, small, crescent-shaped, and unmistakable. She froze mid-step. No, it couldn't be. Her heart lurched forward before her body did. She stepped closer, squinting as if her eyes could somehow be wrong, but they weren't. That mark, she had seen it thousands of times before. She used to joke about it when David was a child. "God kissed you right here," she'd say, pressing her lips gently to the birthmark on his neck. It was identical. She didn't remember dropping the basket. It fell from her hands and hit the pavement with a dull thud, boxes of untouched food scattering across the ground. The children turned, startled by the noise. The little boy stared at her, his big eyes wide and unsure. Margaret stared back, unable to breathe. Her legs felt weak. She reached out as if to steady herself, but there was nothing to hold on to. Her mind raced. Was it a coincidence? It had to be. There was no other explanation. But her mother's heart, the one that had grieved for 5 years, whispered otherwise, whispers that grew louder with every second. The girl stepped forward, worried. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Margaret blinked, slowly returning to herself. She looked down at the girl, so polite, so careful, and nodded slightly, though her lips couldn't form words. Then her eyes returned to the boy. The mark, the eyes, the way he held his sister's hand, just like David used to hold hers when he was little. And suddenly she needed answers. She took a breath and asked, gently, "Where's your mother, sweetheart?" The boy hesitated, his small hand clutching the doorknob behind him. "She's inside," he said softly. "She's sick. She doesn't get out of bed much anymore." "Is it just the 3 of you here?" Margaret asked again, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. The children looked at each other. The girl nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It's just us." Margaret stepped closer to the door. The air inside the building was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, medicine. She hesitated, unsure if she was crossing a line, but something deep within her, stronger than pride, stronger than fear, told her to go on. "Would it be all right if I just said hello to your mom?" The children hesitated, then opened the door slowly. The hallway was dark, lit only by a small bulb flickering near the ceiling. The walls were yellowed, the floors warped with age. But Margaret saw none of it. All she could feel was the pounding in her chest, louder than the city outside, louder than the doubts screaming in her head. The room at the end of the hall was small, barely enough space for a twin bed, a chipped dresser, and a folding chair by the window. And lying on the bed, barely visible under a threadbare blanket, was a woman, pale still, her breath shallow. But Margaret knew that face. even through the years and the weight of sickness. Even without the soft glow of youth that once lit her eyes, Margaret knew her. Anna, the girl she had once driven away with cruelty, now lay before her alone, struggling, and unrecognizable but unmistakable. Time slowed. Regret rose like a tide. She stood at the edge of the room, her hand covering her mouth, and all she could do was whisper, "Oh dear God, what had she done?" The twins walked past her quietly and crawled up beside their mother. The boy stroked Anna's hand gently. The girl whispered, "Mom, someone's here to see you." Anna stirred. Her eyes opened, slowly, reluctantly, and when they landed on Margaret, something changed in the air like a storm silently rolling in. There was no recognition at first, only confusion. Then her eyes widened. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. A cough escaped instead, wry-wrenching, violent. Margaret rushed forward, but Anna weakly turned her head away, not ready to receive help from the woman who had once broken her life. Margaret knelt beside the bed, her heart shattering. "Anna," she said, her voice low, shaking. "It's me, Margaret. I didn't know about them." Tears gathered in Anna's eyes, but she looked away. "I need to help you," Margaret continued. "Please, let me help you." But Anna didn't answer. She simply closed her eyes, as if the weight of remembering was too much to bear. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of the life she once tried to control, Margaret understood. This was not just about David anymore. This was about what he had left behind, about what still could be saved. Because somewhere in the pain, in the silence, and in the birthmark on a little boy's neck, Margaret saw not just a second chance, but a responsibility she could no longer walk away from. She rose to her feet slowly, her mind racing with questions, her heart already making decisions she hadn't yet spoken aloud. And in the stillness of that dim room, one thing became clear. The truth had returned, not with anger, but with eyes full of innocence. It was now up to her to choose what she would do with it. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, casting long shadows through the alleyways of San Jose. But for Margaret Whitmore, something had just begun to rise. Margaret had walked through luxury for most of her life: marble floors, imported chandeliers, silent elevators that led to penthouse suites with sweeping views of San Francisco Bay. But now, each step she took down the narrow hallway of the slum apartment felt like entering a different world. The air was thick with mildew and silence. Her designer heels sank into the worn, uneven floorboards, and the dim light flickered above her like a warning. Yet she moved forward, drawn by something stronger than fear. The children led her to the farthest unit room, 207, its door sagging on rusted hinges, a strip of duct tape covering a crack in the window pane. This was no place for children, no place for anyone. Margaret swallowed hard as the little girl gently turned the doorknob. Inside, the room was barely larger than her walk-in closet. The scent of mold and cheap cough syrup clung to the stale air. A single threadbare blanket covered the woman on the bed, no pale, motionless, her breaths shallow like autumn wind through broken blinds. Beside the bed, a small table held half-empty medicine bottles, a chipped glass of water, and a handwritten note: "Don't forget to take both pills." The sight made Margaret's throat tighten. In the low light, Anna looked like a shadow of the young woman she once knew, fragile, colorless, her skin drawn tight over bone. Her hair, once thick and wild, lay in limp strands around her face. Time had been unkind. Suffering had been crueler. Margaret took a step forward, but the floor creaked beneath her, and Anna stirred. Slowly, her eyes opened. At first, there was only confusion. But as the seconds passed, recognition flickered, then hardened into something else: pain, fear, and something colder: distrust. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't let her. A fit of coughing shook her small frame. Margaret rushed to her side, but Anna turned her face away. "Don't," she said, barely a whisper. Her voice was dry, cracked, as if every word cost more strength than she could afford. "I didn't." "No," Margaret said, kneeling beside the bed. Her voice trembled, not with panic, but with shame. "Anna, I didn't know about them. I didn't know about your children. About David's children." Anna closed her eyes, but a single tear slipped down her cheek. "They're all I have left of him," Margaret continued. "And I pushed you away. I was wrong. So wrong." Anna said nothing. In the silence, Margaret glanced at the two children, who now stood quietly by the doorway, uncertain. They weren't afraid, not exactly. Just unsure of this sudden shift in their quiet world. The boy moved to his mother's side and gently tucked the blanket around her, brushing a strand of hair from her face with care far beyond his age. Margaret watched him, a strange ache rising in her chest. She had once watched David do that very same thing for her, when she had been sick with pneumonia many years ago. He was just 9 then, standing on tiptoe to bring her soup he had warmed himself in the microwave. History, it seemed, had a way of circling back. She turned her attention back to Anna. You need help, medical care, food, a place safe for them. I can provide that. I don't need your money, Anna whispered. Her words were weak, but her pride stood tall. I'm not offering money, Margaret said gently. I'm offering responsibility, the kind I should have accepted long ago. Another silence, another cough, and then Anna finally opened her eyes and looked straight at Margaret. They're David's, she said. Both of them. I found out I was pregnant after we parted. I tried to find him, but I never could. Margaret's chest hollowed at the words. She had stolen more than love. She had stolen a family. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly. I tried, Anna said, tears finally falling freely. But your son-in-law, Michael, ... he found me. Told me David was gone. That you wanted nothing to do with me. That I was a mistake. The name hit Margaret like a slap. Michael. The man married to her daughter, her trusted business partner, her surrogate son after David died. He had lied. He had kept all of this from her. But why? I didn't want your pity, Anna continued. I didn't want to come crawling back. I just wanted to raise them, to keep them safe. Margaret took her hand. This time, Anna didn't pull away. Not here to pity you, Margaret said. I'm here because they're my family. You are. I may not deserve a second chance, but they do. A sharp, raspy cough interrupted the moment. Anna's body trembled under the thin blanket, and this time Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone from her coat pocket. I'm calling an ambulance. You need to go to the hospital. I'll make sure you get the best care. Anna didn't resist. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet hope that anyone was finally here to stand with her, as Margaret made the call. Her voice calm but firm. The children sat quietly on either side of their mother. The girl held Anna's hand, while the boy leaned into her side. We'll take care of her, the girl said softly. Margaret looked at them, at their eyes, their posture, their quiet strength. You shouldn't have to, she replied. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to rise faint, but growing. Time was moving again, and with it, so was something else. A truth that Margaret could no longer ignore. The woman on the bed, once dismissed as a threat, was the mother of her grandchildren. The children she never knew she had. The family that David had left behind, lost, just hidden. And with the sirens came the moment Margaret knew was coming. The beginning of a new chapter. Not one she had written, not one she had expected, but one she would walk into, no matter how hard, because the past, as it was, had opened a door she could no longer shut. The emergency room at St. Cecilia's Medical Center was quiet for a moment, as though time itself was holding its breath. Margaret sat alone in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the silver double doors that had closed behind Anna minutes earlier. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. Nurses moved with practiced grace. But inside Margaret, everything was chaos. She had called ahead, pulled strings, and secured Anna the best room, the best care. Her name, Margaret Whitmore, still opened doors. But for the first time in her life, it didn't feel like power. It felt like a second chance, trying desperately to make up for her first failure. In the corner of the room sat the twins and Ben. Their legs dangled from the two tall chairs, their faces pale, their eyes flicking between the unfamiliar walls, and the woman who had suddenly entered their lives. They had said little on the ride here, and even now, they clung to each other like shadows, afraid of being separated. Margaret rose and knelt in front of them. Would it be all right if I sat with you? She asked gently. The girl and he nodded. She was the older twin by minutes, Margaret had learned, fierce and protective in a way that broke her heart. Your mother's in good hands, she whispered. She's going to get the help she needs now. I promise. Ben looked up at her, eyes wide. You know our mom. Margaret hesitated. Then, she nodded. I did. A long time ago. And I knew your father too. Annie's eyes narrowed with curiosity. He's not here. Mummy said he lives in heaven. Margaret swallowed hard, steadying herself. Yes, David, ... your father, was my son. There it was. The truth. Spoken aloud, hanging in the sterile air like a fragile string between past and present. The children stared, unsure. "What does that mean?" Ben asked, barely a whisper. "It means," Margaret said slowly, her voice cracking despite her efforts, "that I'm your grandmother." Annie blinked. "You single quotes our grandma." Margaret nodded again, her eyes misting. "Yes, sweetheart, I am. I didn't know about you until today. If I had," she stopped herself. "Excuses didn't belong here. Not with children. I'm just so sorry I wasn't there." Annie looked down at her hands. Ben leaned against her shoulder, silent. And then, almost without warning, Annie asked, "Did you love our dad?" The question struck Margaret like lightning, not because it was cruel, but because it was pure, a child's way of understanding her place in the world. "I loved him more than anything," she said, her voice steady now. "But I didn't always show it the right way. I made mistakes. Ones I can't undo." Ben spoke up, his voice small. "Do we look like him?" Margaret smiled through tears. "You do. You both do. Your eyes. The way you sit close together. He was like that when he was little, always looking out for others." Silence returned for a beat. Then Annie reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn photograph. It was crinkled at the edges. A young David and Anna, smiling, arms around each other, probably taken with an old phone years ago. "Mom keeps this under her pillow," she said. "She says it helps her sleep." Margaret took the photo into her trembling hands. Her breath caught. David's smile, so familiar, so full of life, felt like a punch to the chest. She hadn't seen that face in so long. And Anna, She looked radiant, so different from the frail figure in the hospital bed. She handed the photo back, but gently, with reverence. "That's a beautiful memory. I'm glad she kept it." At that moment, the doctor appeared through the swinging doors, his face calm but serious. Margaret stood up quickly. "She's stable for now," he said. "Exhaustion, malnutrition, severe pneumonia. But she's responding to treatment. We'll need to keep her for at least a few days." "Can I see her?" Margaret asked. The doctor nodded. "One visitor. Just for a few minutes." Margaret turned to the children. "Would you like to come with me?" They looked at each other, then back at her. Annie nodded. The hospital room was quiet and dim. Machines beeped softly in rhythm with Anna's shallow breaths. Her skin still looked pale, but there was more color now. Her chest rose and fell in steadier waves. Margaret walked to her bedside and gently placed a hand over Anna's. Anna stirred, blinking slowly. Her voice came hoarse and faint. "You brought them." "I did," Margaret said, her throat tightening. "They're safe. You're safe." Anna's eyes glistened, and for a moment, the hostility between them forgotten, but suspended. "I told them the truth," Margaret added. "They know who they are, who David was." Anna's lips quivered. She turned her gaze toward the twins, who stood at the edge of the bed. "Mom," Annie whispered. "She says she's our grandma." Anna looked at Margaret, then at the children, and finally back again. "I never wanted to keep them from you," she said. "I just, I didn't know if you'd ever want them." "I didn't know they existed," Margaret replied, voice thick with emotion. "But now that I do, I can't walk away. I don't want to." Anna closed her eyes and nodded slowly. There was peace in that gesture, shaky, imperfect, but real. And then, as if the weight of the past had finally shifted, Anna whispered, "Take care of them. If something happens to me, promise me you will." Margaret tightened her grip on Anna's hand. "You're going to get better." "But yes, I promise, no matter what." As the nurse stepped in to signal the end of the visit, Margaret turned back to the twins. They were huddled together again, quiet but no longer uncertain. She opened her arms, then walked into them first. Then Annie followed. And in that moment, something broke inside Margaret's hand. Something else healed. She had lost her son, but she had found the very pieces of him he'd left behind. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope again, not for what was lost, but for what still could be saved. Outside, the wind picked up over the hospital parking lot, rustling leaves across the sidewalk like scattered memories. Margaret knew she had begun something new, but she also knew the past wasn't done with her yet. There were still questions unanswered, still shadows cast by Michael's name. And somewhere, beneath the surface of this fragile reunion, a darker truth was waiting to be uncovered. The third morning at the hospital arrived cloaked in an eerie stillness. Rain tapped softly against the window of Anna's room, a lullaby for a soul drifting toward its final hours. The machines hummed steadily, but Margaret knew deep down, that the rhythm was changing. She had seen this kind of stillness before, the kind that visits just before someone lets go. Anna's strength had begun to fade overnight. Her breath had grown shallower, her words more sparse. Though the antibiotics were working, her body, fragile from years of quiet endurance, was surrendering. The doctors had used soft words. "We're doing everything we can." But Margaret heard what they weren't saying, and it shattered something inside her that had only just begun to rebuild. The twins sat quietly beside their mother, one on each side, their small hands gripping hers. They didn't cry, at least not yet. Children often know more than we give them credit for. They understood that something was coming, even if they didn't fully grasp the shape of it. Margaret stood nearby, unsure whether to be a comfort or a witness. Every time Anna opened her eyes, she offered a faint smile, as though trying to reassure them all that she wasn't afraid. But behind that smile was a resignation that Margaret recognized a mother's final act of strength. That afternoon, when the nurses gave them a moment alone, Margaret took a deep breath and stepped closer. "I spoke to the attorney," she said gently. "All the paperwork is ready. I'll take the children home with me as soon as they're ready. Your name will stay on everything. They'll know who their mother was, who she is." Anna looked up slowly, her eyes glassy but alert. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." "No," Margaret said, her own throat tightening. "Thank you for giving me back a piece of David, for raising them, for everything I took from you." Anna didn't respond right away. She blinked slowly, as if every word needed to be chosen with care. "You were scared," she said softly. "I was too. We just loved him differently." Margaret's lips trembled. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry, I know," Anna replied. "But they're all that matters now." She turned her gaze toward Annie and Ben. The boy had dozed off with his head on her shoulder, and Annie quietly read from a picture book, though her eyes drifted often to her mother's face. Margaret watched them for a long moment. "They'll be loved, protected, and they'll never forget you." Anna closed her eyes again, and when she opened them, they held something new: urgency. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice faint but firm. "About Michael." Margaret's heart lurched. "What about him?" "He knew ... before you did. About them, about me." She coughed weakly, and Margaret reached for a glass of water, helping her sip. Anna continued. "He came to me, told me to stay away, said if I ever showed up again, it would ruin everything." Margaret froze. "He told you that?" Anna nodded. "He offered money. Threatened. Not with violence, but with consequences. Said David wouldn't want his name tied to someone like me." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. "He told me you vanished, that you took the money and disappeared." Anna gave a weary smile. "I thought you said that." "No, I never said that." Her voice was low now, tight with something dangerous. "He lied to both of us." Anna's breathing became slower. Her eyelids fluttered. "Be careful with him. He's not who you think he is." "I will," Margaret whispered. "I promise." Anna opened her eyes one final time and turned to look at her children. "Tell them I tried, that I never stopped loving them, that I wish I had more time." Tears ran silently down Margaret's cheeks. She knelt at Anna's bedside, reaching out to take her hand, now cold and thin like parchment. "They'll know," she said. "I'll make sure they always know." As the rain thickened against the hospital window, Anna exhaled slowly, a breath that sounded like relief. Her hand relaxed in Margaret's. And then, stillness, the kind that no machine could mask, the kind that fills a room with finality. The nurse entered quietly, checked the monitors, and nodded with practiced grace. Margaret stood and turned toward the twins, who seemed to understand without being told. Annie leaned over and kissed her mother's cheek. Ben followed, his small hand trembling. Margaret wrapped her arms around them both. "She loved you more than anything," she said. "She still does. And now it's my job to carry that love." For her, they didn't speak. They only leaned into her. Later that evening, as the sun broke briefly through the clouds and cast a soft amber light over the parking lot, Margaret stood outside the hospital with two small hands in hers. They had said goodbye, but not to love. Love, she knew now, had a way of surviving everything, even death. But what Anna had whispered in her final moments now echoed louder than grief. Michael. A name now stained with secrets. As Margaret helped the children into her car, her face hardened not with anger, but with clarity. The past wasn't done speaking, and the future would depend on what she uncovered next. Because if Anna was right, if Michael had manipulated, silenced, and betrayed, then the loss of David hadn't been fate. It had been orchestrated, and Margaret Whitmore was about to find out just how deep the betrayal ran. The next morning, Margaret sat alone in the vast library of her estate, a fire burning low behind her, though the room felt colder than it had in years. On the table before her lay an old photograph of David, smiling in his graduation gown, and beside it Anna's faded note with her final words scrawled at the bottom. "Be careful with Michael. He's not who you think he is." She stared at that sentence for a long time. For most of the last decade, Michael had been like a second son to her. After David's death, he stepped into the family business with a quiet steadiness that Margaret had come to rely on. He married her daughter, helped expand the company, and even handled her personal affairs during those dark months when grief had hollowed her out. She had trusted him with her business, with her family, with her future. But now, the pieces no longer fit. The missing years, the strange way he had always brushed off Anna's memory, the false story about her disappearance, and most haunting of all, his silence the day Margaret first met the twins. He had been cold, almost startled, but he said nothing. No recognition, no shock, just stillness. She picked up her phone and dialed. "Michael," she said when he answered, "we need to talk. Today." His voice was calm, professional. "Of course. I can come by the house this afternoon," she agreed. But even as she ended the call, something in her gut tightened. By noon, her private investigator, someone she had quietly hired the moment. Anna's warning echoed in her ears, arrived with a thick folder. "I don't know what you're expecting to find," the man said carefully. "But what I found, it's not good." Margaret didn't flinch. She opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning pages of financial records, call logs, and security reports. Michael had been quietly redirecting company funds, small amounts at first, then larger sums hidden through shell corporations and international accounts. He had created a network so complex it would take months to fully trace. But the most damning part wasn't the money. It was the timeline. 3 months before David's death, Michael had taken out a massive life insurance policy, in David's name, listing the company as beneficiary. 2 weeks before the crash, Michael had contacted a private investigator, asking him to track Anna's whereabouts. And 1 week after the crash, he had signed a power of attorney agreement granting himself near total control of David's holdings within the firm. Fingers trembled as she turned the final page. A printed email from Michael to a known real estate fixer. The subject line chilled her. "The Anna problem. Handle quietly." She closed the folder and sat back. Her chest burned, not with grief this time, but with betrayal. Layer upon layer, not just of her son, not just of Anna, but of everything she had trusted. When Michael arrived later that day, he was his usual composed, self-clean suit, easy smile, practiced charm. But Margaret saw him now with different eyes. "I wanted to speak with you about Anna," she began, watching him carefully. Michael nodded slowly. "I was sorry to hear about her. A tragic situation. You remember her, then?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Of course. I didn't know she was still around." Margaret leaned forward. "You knew exactly where she was. You paid her to stay away. You lied to me about everything." The shift in his posture was subtle, but there. A tightening of the jaw. A flicker in his eyes. "I don't know what you think you've found," he said cautiously. "But I did what I had to do to protect this family. To protect your son's legacy." "You don't protect a legacy by destroying it," Margaret said, her voice rising. "You don't protect David by letting his children grow up in poverty. You don't protect this family by burying the truth." Michael stood, adjusting his cuffs. "You're emotional, Margaret, I understand. But this isn't the time." She stood too, fire now in her voice. "The time is exactly now. I trusted you. I let you into my family, into my home. And all the while, you were carving out your own empire behind my back." Michael looked at her, his face colder than she'd ever seen it. "You don't know what it was like, picking up the pieces after David died. You were lost. The company was collapsing. Someone had to take control." Margaret stepped closer. "And instead of saving us, you chose to steal from us. And you let a mother die alone, while you played the role of savior." For the first time, Michael's composure cracked. She made her choice. "No," Margaret said, her voice calm now, terrifying in its quiet. "You made hers for her." Michael turned, heading for the door. "You won't get away with this," she said behind him. "I have evidence. Everything." He paused at the threshold. "Be careful, Margaret. You don't want to make this a war." She met his gaze. "It already is." He left without another word. That evening, Margaret filed the documents with the district attorney. Fraud, embezzlement, corporate conspiracy. And she submitted a sworn statement about Anna's final words. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Michael had influence, connections. But so did she. And this time, she wasn't protecting power. She was protecting family. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, and the twins slept peacefully upstairs for the first time in a real bed, Margaret stood at the window of her study and whispered a name to herself. David. She had failed him once. But now, the path ahead was clear. It was time to finish what Anna had started. And soon, justice would no longer be a wish, it would be a reckoning. The days that followed moved slowly, like a storm gathering at the edge of a silent sky. Margaret no longer moved with the precise confidence that once defined her. Now every step was deliberate, every word measured, not because she was uncertain, but because she was watching the past resurface in ways she had never anticipated. The twins settled into their new room at the estate, their laughter faint but growing, a sound Margaret had not heard in her home since David died. Yet amid that fragile peace, another truth pulled at her, the question that had haunted her for years. What really happened the night her son's car crashed on that rain-slicked road? Until now, she had accepted the official story. A tragic accident. David lost control in the rain. Alone, no foul play. No questions asked. But with each passing day, and with Anna's final warning still echoing in her mind, Margaret realized she had asked too little, far too late. The investigator she had hired returned. This time with something Margaret never expected. A report on an elderly man named Hector Alvareza, retired city sanitation worker. For years, he had told anyone who would listen that he had witnessed a black SUV tailing a silver coupe on Skyline Drive the night of David's crash. His report had been dismissed by the local police as unreliable, attributed to age and poor memory. But Margaret had read every word of his statement. I saw them. I swear I did. The SUV was too close, almost pushing him. She requested a meeting immediately. Hector welcomed her into his modest home, tucked in the outskirts of Daly City. A place lined with fading family portraits and the warmth of old memories. He walked slowly with a cane, but his mind was sharp. I remember it clear, he said, sipping slowly from a mug of coffee. I was driving home late. It was pouring. Headlights came fast behind me, so I pulled to the side. That's when I saw them. The silver coupe, the boy's car. He looked panicked. And behind him, that black SUV. No license plate on the front. Margaret leaned in. Did you tell anyone? Hector nodded. Twice. Police didn't take it seriously. Said it was just a chase gone wrong. But I know what I saw. That wasn't no accident. That car forced him. Her stomach twisted. You're sure? I've been on the road 40 years. I know what a forced swerve looks like. The kid didn't stand a chance. Margaret returned home in silence. The puzzle was no longer abstract. It had names, motives, angles, and at the center of it all was Michael, the man who had everything to gain from David's death. The policy, the position, the power. Back at the estate, she pulled David's crash file from her private records, something she hadn't opened in 5 years. Photos, autopsy reports, witness statements, and buried beneath the pages, a note from her late husband's friend, a traffic analyst who had looked into the crash at her request. It read, skid pattern, inconsistent with loss of control. Driver reacted late, as if pushed. She had never questioned that line before. Now, she couldn't stop questioning it. The more she dug, the darker it became. Phone records showed that Michael had made 3 calls to a disposable phone the night of the accident, calls that pinged near Skyline Drive. Surveillance footage, fuzzy, grainy, but real, showed a black SUV leaving a garage the same night. The car belonged to one of Michael's contractors, a man who disappeared 3 weeks after the crash. No trace, no follow-up. Margaret's hands shook as she closed the file. This wasn't just betrayal, it was murder. She sat in her study long into the night, the fireplace dimming to embers, the twins asleep upstairs. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The creak of old wood, the distant whistle of wind, the beating of her own heart. She had thought she was done grieving, but now, the grief returned in a new form, colder, angrier. She had buried her son under the illusion of fate, but fate had been hijacked by greed. And now, she would no longer stand by. At dawn, she met with her attorney and handed over everything: the investigators' files, the reports, the crash analysis, even Hector's statement. Her instructions were clear. Turn it all in. To the DA. To the press. To the board. I want every corner of this uncovered. The attorney hesitated. Margaret, if this goes public, it could shake everything. The company, your name. The family. Margaret looked up. Her voice was low but unshakable. This is the family. Truth is the only thing I have left to give David now. I'll burn every deal, every dollar, every reputation, if that's what it takes. The weight of those words echoed through the walls of the office. By evening, subpoenas were being drafted. Interviews lined up, evidence archived. Mikhail had tried to erase a life, but Margaret Whitmore was bringing it back one fact at a time, one truth at a time, one wound at a time. She stood at David's old room that night, the door finally open. She stepped inside. For the first time in years, everything was just as he left it. A stack of jazz vinyls, a painting he never finished, the last book he had been reading, now faded with time. She sat quietly at the edge of the bed and whispered into the silence. They'll know, David, they'll all know. And in that moment, the house felt different. Not just haunted, but awake. Because justice, long buried beneath silence and sorrow, had begun to rise. And soon, the man who had taken everything would face what he never saw coming. Consequences. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind that gave the illusion of peace. Sunlight streamed through the high windows of Margaret's estate, casting long golden bars across the oak floor. The twins were upstairs in the playroom, giggling softly, as they colored in thick books she had ordered just for them. In the kitchen, Margaret stood by the sink, her back to the door, watching the trees sway in the breeze like silent sentinels. She had just returned from a closed-door meeting with the district attorney's office. Charges were being prepared. The case was building faster than anyone had expected. Margaret was exhausted, but focused. Her entire life had narrowed to a single purpose: seeing justice served for David, for Anna, and for the children upstairs who still didn't fully understand the shadow that had hung over their lives. Michael hadn't reached out, not once since their confrontation, but that didn't surprise her. He was calculating, dangerous, and now, which made him unpredictable. That was what worried her most. That afternoon, around 3 p.m., Margaret's longtime housekeeper, Irene, brought her a tray of tea. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Earl Grey, brewed exactly as she liked it, with a slice of lemon. Irene placed the tray on the table near the window and gave her a gentle smile. Thought you might need a moment to breathe. Thank you, Irene, Margaret replied, managing a faint smile. You always know. She sat, lifted the cup to her lips, and paused as a small voice echoed from the stairs. Grandma. It was Ben, peeking around the corner, holding a drawing in his hand. I made something for you, he said. Running toward her, Margaret set the teacup down and opened her arms, welcoming the boy into her lap. He showed her the drawing: two stick figures, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. It's me and you, he explained proudly. You're smiling. She smiled for real then. It's perfect. He pointed to the teacup. Can I smell your tea? I like the lemon. She chuckled and lowered the cup for him. All right, just don't spill it. Ben leaned in and sniffed. Then his nose wrinkled. It smells funny, he said. Not like the lemon one last night. Margaret froze. She brought the cup closer to her own face this time. Not to drink, but to really smell. There it was, just beneath the bergamot and citrus, a faint, bitter undertone. Metallic. Wrong. Her hands trembled slightly. Irene, she called out, calm but sharp. Can you come here a moment? The housekeeper returned, drying her hands on her apron. Yes, ma'am. Margaret held up the cup. Where did this tea come from? Irene blinked. From the usual batch. I just heated the water and steeped the leaves. But, oh wait, I didn't prepare the tray. Michael dropped by earlier. He said you'd asked for tea and left it with the staff to bring up. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Michael had been here. In her home. Without warning. Did he see the children? She asked, her voice tightening. No, Irene said, shaking her head. Just said he couldn't stay long. Margaret stood, her chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the wood. She walked to the sink, poured the tea carefully down the drain, and watched as the liquid swirled into darkness. Then she picked up the phone and dialed her security consultant. I need that cup tested, now. Quietly. The response was immediate. Within hours, the results came in. Traces of cyanide. The dosage, small but potent, would have been enough to induce cardiac arrest in someone Margaret's age within minutes. Especially if masked by hot citrus. She stood at her bedroom window. That night, the report in her hand, her reflection staring back in the glass. Her mind moved quickly, connecting every thread. The lies, the crash, the cover-up, the silencing of Anna, the attempt to silence her now. Michael hadn't just built his rise on betrayal, he had maintained it through fear. But what he didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that Margaret Whitmore had already lost everything once. And now, with nothing left to fear, she was more dangerous than ever. She walked down the hall and paused outside the children's door, listening to the soft rhythm of their sleep. In that moment, she made a decision, not one of rage, but of clarity. She would not hide, she would not run, she would bring everything to light, even if it meant standing in the fire herself. The next morning, her attorneys filed for a restraining order. Her security team replaced every lock, reviewed every camera, and quietly, a press release was prepared. Margaret Whitmore, former CEO, philanthropist, and mother, would be holding a press conference, not to protect a legacy, but to expose one, because the truth had nearly been silenced again, this time in a porcelain cup, and Margaret would make sure no one ever poured another. The morning of the press conference was gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to weep or hold back. But the atmosphere outside Margaret Whitmore's estate was anything but uncertain. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder behind barricades, their breath visible in the air, microphones ready, lenses pointed at the towering iron gates that had once symbolized power and silence, now about to become the gateway to a storm of truth. Inside, Margaret stood before the mirror in her bedroom, fastening the same brooch her late husband had given her decades ago. Her suit was black, not for mourning, but for solemn resolve. Her eyes, though shadowed with fatigue, were sharper than they had been in years. She was no longer the grieving mother tucked away behind marble walls. She was the voice of what had been stolen and what would never be stolen again. At precisely 10 a.m., she stepped before the cameras. She didn't read from a script. She didn't need one. Her voice was calm, steady, and each word carved into the crowd like chisel into stone. "I am here today not as the former CEO of Whitmore Holdings," she began, "but as a mother, a grandmother, and a witness to the kind of betrayal that can destroy generations." She told the story: David's crash, Anna's death, the hidden grandchildren, and the man who had orchestrated it all from within her own family. She named him Michael Sutton, her once trusted lieutenant, the man who had poisoned her tea less than 48 hours before. As the gasps spread through the crowd, Margaret held up a copy of the forensic report, the financial evidence, the crash analysis, and the sworn testimony from Hector Alvarez. "There are crimes," she said, "that leave no fingerprints, but they leave blood. And I refuse to let that blood be buried any longer." By the time she stepped away from the podium, the district attorney had already issued a warrant. Cameras caught everything. The headlines exploded. And by noon, law enforcement arrived at Michael's downtown office. He didn't run. He didn't resist. But when they led him out in handcuffs, jacket crisp, tie still perfect, face carefully blank, the world saw the unraveling of a man who had built his empire on shadows. For years, he had played the role of loyal husband, grieving brother-in-law, devoted family man. But the performance was over, and the curtain came down in front of flashing bulbs and breaking news tickers. The trial began 6 months later. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. The prosecution laid out the evidence with ruthless precision. The manipulated life insurance policy, the forged documents, the payments to the SUV driver who had mysteriously vanished, and the attempt on Margaret's life, foiled by a child's innocent curiosity. Margaret sat through every session, the twins by her side, now fully under her guardianship. Annie held her hand often, protective beyond her years. Ben clutched a toy David once loved as a child, a small wooden airplane, now worn smooth with time and comfort. Michael's defense tried to shift blame, to paint him as overwhelmed, misunderstood, pressured into decisions by the chaos of David's death. But the jury saw what Margaret already knew. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it smiles in your dining room. On the final day of trial, as closing arguments echoed through the chamber, Margaret was given a chance to speak, not as a witness, but as a mother. She rose slowly and faced the court. "I lost my son once," she said, "to grief, to silence, and to the lies that filled the space I should have occupied with love. But I will not lose his children. And I will not let this man walk free after stealing the future we were meant to have." When the jury returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty, got on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and reckless endangerment. The sentence, life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Michael Sutton's face didn't twitch, but as the guards led him away, he cast one final glance at Margaret, an empty, wordless stare. She met it, not with hatred, but with something far colder. Pity, because in the end, he had destroyed everything for the sake of ambition. And lost the only thing he could never reclaim. Legacy. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed once again, shouting questions, seeking reactions. But Margaret said nothing. She simply wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, held the twins close, and stepped into the waiting car. Justice had been served. But the journey wasn't over, not yet. Because even as the doors closed and the city disappeared behind them, she knew that healing would be its own kind of trial, and for the sake of the children she now called her own, she would face it day by day, memory by memory, truth by truth. Tomorrow, she would begin that next chapter. But today, she had fulfilled a promise. She had stood up, she had spoken out, and David, wherever he was, knew it. The house had changed. Not in its architecture. The high ceilings, marble floors, and grand staircases remained as polished and pristine as ever. But the silence was gone. The kind of silence that had lingered like fog after David's death, thick and unmoving. Now, there were footsteps, light ones, often running. Laughter echoed down the hallways, mixed with piano keys being played clumsily, the occasional crashing of a dropped toy, and the constant, small sounds of life returning. Margaret had never imagined her home could feel like this again. Warm, loud, lived. In every morning began the same now, with Annie tiptoeing into her room just as the sun peeked over the hills, holding a drawing, or a question, or sometimes nothing at all, just needing to be close. Ben followed shortly after, usually hungry, always curious. Together, the three of them would sit by the kitchen window, drinking tea or hot cocoa, wrapped in oversized sweaters, watching the world outside as if they were building a new one from within. Margaret had transformed the west wing of the estate into a space just for them, bright bedrooms with bunk beds and reading nooks, a playroom with walls covered in chalkboard paint, a quiet room for homework and tutoring. Tutors came 3 times a week. A therapist came once, and Margaret, for the first time in her life, was learning what it meant to show up not as a provider, not as a guardian, but as a presence. She was still learning. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when Annie would go quiet at the dinner table, her eyes drifting toward the empty chair where her mother used to sit. Ben would sometimes wake crying, calling out for someone he'd never truly known, his father, perhaps, or just a feeling he couldn't name. In those moments, Margaret didn't rush to fix the silence. She simply held them. She whispered stories of David, the boy who loved paper airplanes and blueberry pancakes, who once tried to build a treehouse in the middle of winter, who painted murals on his bedroom wall without permission and wasn't punished because the art was too beautiful to erase. She told them about Anna too, her strength, her grace, her fierce, quiet love. The children listened, and slowly, the sorrow inside them took shape, not as a void, but as a memory they could carry with pride. Margaret also began to step away from the corporate world, handing over control of Whitmore Holdings to an independent board. She had nothing left to prove. Instead, she founded the David and Anna Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting children who had lost parents. With a focus on education, housing, and mental health support, she poured herself into the work, not to escape the past, but to honor it. Every scholarship granted, every bed built, every book delivered in a child's hand, each one was a small, whispered redemption. And the city noticed, not because of her name, but because of her change. People saw the woman who had once been unreachable, walking hand in hand with 2 children down the sidewalks of San Jose, stopping for street performers, buying secondhand books, sitting on benches and talking not as a tycoon, but as a grandmother with time to give. There was one evening, not long after spring arrived, when Margaret found herself alone in the garden, just outside the children's wing. The twins had gone to bed. The stars were bright, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like peace. She looked up, her eyes glistening. "David," she whispered into the breeze. "They're safe now. I hope you can see it." A soft wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves like a gentle reply. Later that night, she walked upstairs and peeked into the children's room. Annie was curled into a book, reading by flashlight under the covers. Ben was already asleep, the wooden airplane still clutched in his hand. Margaret stood there for a while, simply watching. The way a second chance often doesn't announce itself, it just appears. and it asks for no grand gesture, only presence, only heart. She had failed her son once, but now, every bedtime story, every meal shared, every tear wiped from a child's cheek, that was her way of rewriting what had once gone so terribly wrong. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come in the courtroom or the headlines. Sometimes it comes in the form of two small hands, reaching for yours in the dark. And this time, Margaret would never let go. The cemetery lay just outside the city, nestled at the foot of rolling hills where the wind carried the scent of eucalyptus and wild sage. It was a quiet place, peaceful, private, untouched by the noise of the world. Margaret had chosen this spot years ago, long before any of the pain, when she believed she would be buried beside her husband, and David would someday come to visit. Lay flowers, perhaps bring his own children. She never imagined it would be the other way around. That morning, the sky was pale blue, brushed with soft clouds drifting like thoughts yet spoken. Margaret stood beneath an old sycamore tree, holding the hands of Annie and Ben. Before them stood two identical white stones, side by side, one for David, the other for Anna. Simple, elegant, inscribed with more love than words. Annie knelt first, gently placing a bouquet of fresh daffodils at the base of her mother's headstone. Ben followed with a tiny blue airplane he had made from craft sticks and paint. Margaret said nothing at first. The children bowed their heads, and in the hush that followed, the three of them shared something secreta, silence-filled, not with grief, but with gratitude. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was soft, steady. "We're here," she said. "We've come to show you that we're okay, that your love lives on in these two." Annie looked up at her grandmother, then turned back to the stones. "We miss you," she said simply. "But we're not alone anymore." Margaret placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You never were," she whispered. They stayed for a while, long enough for the breeze to change, for the clouds to part, for the children to laugh quietly as they chased each other among the nearby stones. Margaret sat on the bench and watched them, her heart fuller than it had been in years. This, she thought, was legacy. Not the buildings with her name etched in stone, not the headlines or boardroom portraits, but the resilience of love passed down in quiet ways, in stories told before bed, in songs sung on car rides, in the gentle hands of a child who knows what it means to care for someone else. When they returned home, Margaret went straight to her study. The walls were now lined with photographs. David as a child, Anna with the twins on her lap, Annie and Ben on their first day of school. But at the center of the room stood something new, a framed letter, sealed behind glass, the founding mission of the David and Anna Foundation. It read, "To every child who has lost, to every parent who has loved, may you find light again in the places you thought were lost. Let love be louder than silence. Let care be stronger than fear." Under Margaret's direction, the foundation had already built 3 transitional homes for orphan siblings. Dozens of scholarships had been awarded. Art therapy programs were now being implemented in public schools across the county. The foundation's first annual gala had raised more than she ever imagined it, because people admired her wealth. But because they believed in what she was building. The work wasn't done. It never would be. But for Margaret, that was the beauty of it. Redemption wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime's worth of choosing love, over pride, over power, over silence. And she chose it every day. That evening, the children helped her prepare dinner. Annie grated cheese while Ben proudly poured too much pasta into the boiling pot. They bickered over who got to stir the sauce, then giggled until tears ran down their cheeks. At the table, Margaret raised her glass, not wine, but apple cider, because Ben insisted, and looked at the 2 faces that had brought her back to life. "To family," she said. Annie raised her glass. "To love." Ben grinned. "To pancakes tomorrow." They laughed, clinked glasses, and began to eat. And in the soft, golden light of that kitchen, Margaret saw it clearly. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in layers, in memories reclaimed, in wrongs made right, in legacies rebuilt, not from stone, but from time, from tenderness, from truth. Her home would never be perfect, but it was whole, and for the rest of her days, Margaret Whitmore would carry the love of those she lost by nurturing those she had found. Because in the end, the most powerful legacy is not what we leave behind. It's the love we pass forward.